All right. Thanks everyone for joining us here today. I hope everybody's having a good cup, that you are not overloaded by acronyms and technical terms, that you are keeping in mind that beyond all the policy jargon and running around in the corridors, we're actually dealing with the climate crisis and trying to address that the best we can. So I think we're going to try to make this as least technical as possible, but I guess carbon markets is always a little bit technical, and so in those discussions, really important we all keep in mind that we're not here just to kind of discuss how you trade credits and make things efficient and have liquidity in markets, but we're actually here to get a system that reduces emissions, that promotes sustainable development, that benefits people, that supports and protects human rights. So I just wanted to start by coming back to those fundamental principles so that we really know what we're talking about here. So this side event is about carbon markets, as I just mentioned. Carbon markets are often advertised as a solution to drive climate finance to developing countries. But of course, their track record is not as positive as one could imagine. The practical implementation of carbon markets is very complicated, both at a political and technical level, and the reality is that in the past, markets have not really delivered on the climate benefits and promises that had been made. And in some instances did have negative impacts on local communities. And so here, within this COP, as has been the case in previous COPs, we have negotiations on Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, which is about establishing and regulating carbon markets under the Paris Agreement. And so this side event here is to debate and exchange around how can we make these systems work for developing countries, because previous systems under the Kyoto Protocol have been quite unequal in the way projects were distributed, with very few projects, for example, in the African continent. And so we want to hear today from our different speakers what solutions can we promote, both within the Paris Agreement framework, but also in the voluntary market, so what private companies are doing and how they're using carbon credits. And hear also from the experiences of people who have been in contact on the ground with these projects and what the reality of this is. So with us today, we have Robi Redda, who's sitting on my left, who's the director of SouthSouthNorth, and who has been involved in an initiative called the Voluntary Carbon Markets Global Dialogues, which has been engaging with various stakeholders from civil society, private sector, and governments to try to look at where we are and how can developing countries really play a larger role and be involved in the right way in carbon markets, and he will be talking about that. On my right, we have Kristin Kui, who's a climate diplomacy advisor for Trinidad and Tobago, who is quite involved also in the Article 6 negotiations, and we're grateful to have her here with us. On my left, Mahesh Pandya, who is the director for Paryavaran Mitra, an NGO based in India, and who has been quite active in monitoring the impacts of specific projects a few years ago already under the Clean Development Mechanism, and now is very involved in the sector in projects around waste management. And then our final speaker on my right is Eftimiya Salo, who is the head of carbon projects for Compensate. And Compensate is a Finnish retailer of carbon offsets. They have done quite a bit of interesting work on the voluntary market, looking at what is it that we're actually selling, what are these carbon credits, which ones have environmental integrity and which ones don't. So she will be talking to us about that. So thanks again for everyone who's joining us, and with that I will give the floor to Robi.
Yeah, thank you, Gilles. It's great to be here. I'm not per se a carbon market expert, but we've done this global dialogue to understand the supply side of the voluntary carbon market and see what countries thought about it and how we can improve that. So this work was done by a number of institutions. Climate Focus was the lead. The Indonesia Research Institute for Decarbonization was another. SouthSouthNorth, my organization based in Cape Town, South Africa, was another. Transforma based in Colombia, and finally Vera, which was supported by Vera as well. So why did we do this work? You know, there's a lot of need. You know, the mitigation ambition under Paris is an important element, and also there's the need to scale up finance. And we felt VCM can contribute to this, so that was, in a nutshell, the objective. As I said, we tried to put the supply side of the VCM at the center of the discussions, and we tried to engage actors in developing countries and also conduct a series of consultations to make that happen. The final report, the final output report, was released in October 2021, but after a number of consultations. And I've already described who we were, but a number of experts were also involved in preparing the publications, the position papers on the different stakeholders. So we did a series of 5 papers, one focusing on government's perspectives, another one on project developers' perspective, corporates, thematically also RED+ and on accounting. We started with a series of interviews of, in our case, I was involved with a government paper with those within government that were responsible, had a role in the carbon market, and also advisors to government that were involved in that. We prepared an initial discussion paper, and then we had a number of iteration stakeholder consultations in Africa, Latin America, and Asia. And then, you know, eventually the output was launched. There is an overall recommendation coming out of this process, and these recommendations are around, you know, how government can engage better with the VCM, and also how clear and transparent accounting systems can be there. Certain things on, you know, how can it benefit indigenous people? How can we scale up programs to larger sector and jurisdictional programs, and also cooperation and collaboration. So this is the overall program, the ultimate output of the project. But I would like to say a bit more, because I was actually involved in doing the government perspective paper together with colleagues from Climate Focus, Sandra Greiner and Carolina Inkland. The first thing that came out of this interviews and you know, a sort of high-level observation was that national governments felt they were not as much directly involved in the VCM, and they didn't know of some of the projects that were within their jurisdiction. They always appreciated that VCM had a positive, or they knew the VCM had, you know, some projects that benefited local governments and communities, but there was no mechanism for systematically recording this at by national government. So hence, there was a mixed perception on the risk and opportunities of VCM. You know, there were concerns that, you know, credits generated the credits generated through this process will undermine NDC achievements of countries. And also, you know, as a result, there was some level of suspicion. But on the other hand, there was also realization that, you know, the VCM can be a formidable tool, an important tool to enhance NDC ambition. So some countries were proactive in identifying project opportunities and also in using the private investment and the infrastructure that VCM provided in getting projects running. Overall, in terms of the projects, the type of projects that they felt were important, or from their perspective that VCM can be part of, they felt community and nature-based solutions, particularly due to their broader environmental, societal benefits, were important for VCM to continue. That project should focus on, VCM projects should focus on that. Sustainable agriculture practices was also another area of importance. Energy projects, although there aren't as many VCM projects as we know in the energy sector, they felt it was important for the VCM to engage in that space. And finally, that there was also the interest to see, projects with multiple benefits, multiple SDG benefits that were cross-sector, that had cross-sectoral activity. It's sort of step out of the sectoral silos. Overall, the view was the VCM has been successful in driving additional private sector finance in the global south, but the full potential was not there. It hasn't reached its full potential yet. And they felt there was the need for them as government representatives to be part of this process and ensure that they should be part of, support direct investments to their climate and development needs, collaborating with other actors. So in the way of recommendation based on this, we've identified particularly if the VCM is going to have an important role, because it will have an important role in NDC implementation. The recommendation that came out of this were in 3 areas. One is the need to strategically engage for countries in different carbon market mechanisms, voluntary carbon market being one, and sort of capturing opportunities and steering investments for VCM as part of that process. A sort of prioritization exercise of where VCM can add value was also important, and also creating public-private partnerships. The other is it was also important to support adopted national regulations. One is that in the national context, in the context of environmental social performance standards, they are there in many countries, and ensuring that projects adhere to this is important. Legal and policy frameworks and benefit sharing agreements. So there's a lot more detail in this report, and I'll encourage you to look at it. I put the website over there. Thank you, Gilles.
Thank you, Robi, for sharing that perspective. I guess highlighting the potential for the voluntary market and the engagement that's needed also with governments. With that, I would turn to Kristin. AOSIS has also had some suggestions on how to improve carbon markets, mostly in the context of UN-regulated markets, but perhaps you can draw also from lessons from the voluntary markets. So, yep, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Gilles, and thank you, Robi, for that presentation. I think it helped your insights on NDC implementation and how the voluntary market can help with that. Helps me go into what I'm going to share with you. So as you mentioned, I have been involved in the carbon market negotiations under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement for some time now. So I'm going to try to give you some context in that regard as we speak about how carbon markets can help developing countries. So just in terms of setting the scene, we have the NDCs, which are a tool to achieve reductions that will help us to achieve the Paris Agreement goals, in particular the temperature goals and keeping us below 1.5 degrees Celsius. If any of you have been following the negotiations for some time now, you know that keeping us below 1.5 degrees Celsius is very important for AOSIS. It's critical for AOSIS. That is the threshold at which we set the bar. So Article 6 provides a framework to help parties implement their NDCs, and if you look at the language of the Paris Agreement, it specifically speaks to higher mitigation and adaptation ambition. So with Article 6 providing that framework and allowing for parties to go even further and increase their mitigation ambition, that involves environmental integrity and ensuring environmental integrity and promoting sustainable development. So it's also important to distinguish Article 6 from previous UN mechanisms, such as the Clean Development Mechanisms, because now we're in the Paris Agreement world where everyone has a target. So what happens on the voluntary market, for example, may have to shift a bit given that we're moving into this new regime under the Paris Agreement where everyone has a target. So moving to the question that Gilles posed to us, how can carbon markets help developing countries? With that scene setting, I think my answer to that would be twofold. So on one hand, we can see carbon markets helping developing countries and countries in general to implement their NDCs, and we need that, but the value of markets will really be seen if we have robust carbon market rules that promote environmental integrity. And that's really critical for us. Again, linking it back to the Paris Agreement goals and back to the temperature goal of the Paris Agreement, keeping us well below 1.5 degrees Celsius, we need to ensure that carbon markets that we are developing moving forward help us to achieve those goals and don't undermine ambition, and ensure that parties in using carbon markets to pursue NDC implementation, they are really contributing to that mitigation ambition that we need to see. If you've been following the discussion on the IPCC reports recently, you know that we need a significant amount of mitigation ambition to happen within the next 10 years, and there is a significant gap there. And carbon markets could help us to fill that gap if we did it right, if we did it with robust rules, if we ensure that they promote and ensure environmental integrity. So that's one hand. On one hand, it can help us achieve the ambition that we need under the Paris Agreement. On the other hand is the very practical aspect of carbon markets, which I think will be alluded to, and that is by allowing participation from developing countries in carbon markets. I would say that previous UN mechanisms saw that developing countries were definitely able to participate, but the market was dominated by a few, and smaller countries had difficulties in accessing the market in that way. So if we really want to be promoting carbon markets that allow for developing countries to benefit from it, we need to be able to participate in the market as well, of course, providing that it is a high-quality market that really promotes ambition. From the Trinidad and Tobago perspective, I can say that we will certainly be pursuing every opportunity to ensure that we implement our NDC and achieve our NDC targets. And if the opportunity presents itself through carbon markets, that is something we will pursue, providing that the market that we are engaging in is definitely contributing to our NDC implementation on one hand and achieving the goals of the Paris Agreement as well. All of that being said, and I mentioned it briefly just now, scalability challenges and market feasibility still remain major concerns for small countries, especially small island developing states. There have been attempts to lump or group projects together to allow smaller countries to be able to access the market. And I think that there's nothing preventing that under the Paris Agreement carbon market that we're aiming to set up. But it is something that needs to be addressed. The private sector in small countries, especially in small island developing states, faces significant challenges and barriers and gaps. And there are many studies out there that talk about this. And you can find studies from credible organizations such as the World Bank, etc., speaking about the challenges that small islands face with regard to the barriers for the private sector. So we also want to ensure that in setting up the carbon market, we are able to address some of those barriers to ensure that countries like those from AOSIS can participate. So to sum up, I'll say ideally we want to see that big market players adhere to the principles, the robust principles that we're hoping to achieve if we're able to close the Paris rulebook and set up Article 6 here. And we want to ensure that the carbon markets that players participate in are strong on environmental integrity and robustness, and ensure that we deliver an overall mitigation in global emissions. And that's a really technical term that comes from the negotiations, but what it really means is that we are going above and beyond to ensure that we are sticking to the Paris Agreement goals and staying below 1.5 degrees Celsius. Deciding the rules on Article 6 here, I think is really critical for us to close out the Paris Agreement rulebook and also to provide carbon markets with the certainty that they need going forward, and to leverage the private sector for the necessary climate action that we need to see. And I'll close out by saying that we have in Trinidad and Tobago a very vibrant private sector that is willing to engage in the markets and willing to work with us in terms of ensuring that we have a high quality market. But they need the clarity and certainty that we can provide as negotiators here under the Paris Agreement. So I think that's it. I'll sum up there and pass it back to Gilles.
Thanks, Kristin. I already have a few questions, but I will keep them for later. And remind you also that we will have time for questions later, so you can already think about what you would like to ask. In the meantime, I'll pass it over to Mahesh, who will talk to us a bit more about the reality of carbon markets. What does it mean for projects on the ground concretely, and what role can they play, especially in the sector of waste management?
Yeah, please, presentation, please. Yeah. Namaste and good evening. Greetings from India. I would like to put two stories together. One, carbon market itself is success if the industries itself are doing, but for the waste management, it's a big failure in my state. And also, that is my blame through these conferences. Even the press this climate change agreement and all, the waste management issue is like untouchable issue. We are talking about the Amazon and adaptation and mitigation and all, but we are not able to focus properly about the waste management. There's a very much serious issue, but now we have to connect properly about the waste management and the Amazon. And the poor countries and poor people are facing a lot, because nowadays the waste is imported by some poor countries in their countries because of getting money and all. So it's a subject, and that is why I touch upon this subject. Need for carbon credit for the waste management. Earlier I was monitoring the carbon credit and I was not happy because I was telling, and with the proof, that the CDM project it was a corrupt development mechanism. So I'm not telling exactly that carbon credit for the waste management, but something like that it should be. So the people can encourage, people can get the inspiration to manage the waste. Next please. Sorry. Yeah. In my state there is a system called the cap and trade. Internally they are trading the carbon, and the good result, because there is no transparency. Only the industries and government are involved, and they are happy to each other, and they are allowed for the Amazon and all. So I'm not going to deep in that because I have to speak a lot. The industrial pollution is there, people are fighting for that, and that is why the industries are getting the closer because of the pressure of the peoples and the judiciary, and that is why they find a system called cap and trade, and it is a success. And now they are going forward to have a cap and trade system. What is this is on this thing is a trade between the industries and industries, and they are decided their value by themselves. So one hand, my state is success in industries at cap and trade, which is not exactly carbon credit as per the CDM system, which is imposed by the UNFCCC, but this system is success. So it is like eye wash basically, I can say like that. To survive the industry, we want GDP We want 5 trillion American dollars GDP, and that is why we have this kind of system, and it is success. But on the other hand, the waste management system is totally failed. Yeah. Again, I'm not talking much about the cap and trade system in Gujarat. An important project has been stopped because of the not gaining a carbon credit. It's a good story about the failure of the carbon credit on waste management. To get a handsome amount of money from the World Bank, my government asked World Bank to fund for waste management in 159 towns. But after the getting the fund and all, they spent somewhere else, and for that, the Gujarat government set up the Gujarat Urban Development Company itself to get the money from the World Bank. But afterward, till this project has not come up, and out of 159 towns, only the 19 towns have joint kind of waste management system. But our India's Supreme Audit Authority, which is called the CAG, our Supreme Audit Authority CAG criticized the policy of our Gujarat state that you received the fund from the World Bank, and even though you are failed to set up a waste management system in towns, because Gujarat government is not interested to apply even the carbon credit. They got a fund in the name of the carbon credit from the World Bank, but ultimately my point is, government is not interested in the waste management system. In India, since 6 years, we are having a program called Clean India, Swachh Bharat Abhiyan, the photo story and photo session and everything. But actually, there is a big mountain of the dumping in each of the towns and the cities. In like my city called Ahmedabad, where our Prime Minister is coming from, 72-meter high mountain of the garbage, and surrounding more than 1 million people are residue, and they have a problem of the air pollution because 24 hours this mountain are burning because of the waste and all. But government is not thinking about, and that is why. That is my recommendation is like, my recommendation is I am not go for the carbon credit because I have very bad experience in India, because we monitored several projects of the carbon credit and it was a fraud kind of things, and number of times we also mentioned to the executive board of the United Nations Framework on this in conference. But now, is there any alternative or system can we find out so the corporate sector can involve in the waste management? So government can give some kind of encouragement of some incentives or some rating, so the people can come forward like carbon market, but not exactly carbon market, but something for the corporate sector, so they can invest it and have a good waste management system. Also, I would like to say that India is, famous for Mahatma Gandhi, and Mahatma Gandhi was telling the minimum use of the natural resources, and whatever the requirement, use only this, and if this philosophy we can use, then there is no have kind of excess amount of the waste. But today, our government and the previous government and all talking about the Gandhi's philosophy, but actually they are doing the reverse, because we are just producing more and more, wasting more and more about the economy. We are telling that, oh, we have to reach to the fifth kind of economic country in the world and achieve the benchmark. And in this kind of ideology of the government, they are not interested to manage the waste, and that is why it's a human right issue for the poor people, because they are collecting the waste in unhygienic conditions. So that is my recommendation to the government, and also I brought a number of times to my government about think about the waste pickers, think about the waste management. Even the 2 times I went to the National Green Tribunal to manage this kind of mountain of garbage. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Thanks, Mahesh, for sharing your experience and yeah, also discussing this distinction between carbon credit markets, which previous speakers have been talking about, that are functioning quite differently from emissions trading systems, and that they can be used in very different situations. And I think we have examples, for example, in the EU of emissions trading systems that are starting to function a bit better than the experience we've had so far with carbon credit markets at the UN level. So that's also something to always consider. With that, I would pass it on to Effie to share her perspective with the work they've done at Compensate.
So hello everyone, my name is Eftimiya Salo and I'm head of carbon projects at Compensate. So Compensate is a Finnish non-profit which offers companies and individuals access to high quality carbon capture projects. And while we are an offset provider, we are quite unique and differentiate from the rest offset providers on the market. And here are 4 key differences. So we have a scientific advisory panel which guides us into the right direction and in terms of carbon capture methods and also high quality projects. With their help, we have developed our own carbon evaluation criteria against which we evaluate all carbon projects which we consider. And this leads to a highly selective carbon capture portfolio which we offer to our clients, where only few projects are admitted, and I will tell you about this later. And the third is high overcompensation, which in practice means that we buy more carbon credits than it's actually necessary to make a claim, because we don't believe that 1 carbon credit actually equals to 1 ton of CO2, which is the general conception. And this is due to uncertainties and risk with the carbon credits and also overestimation of their impact. And finally, we are a non-profit with full transparency. We disclose all our finances on our website. You can see how we spend our money and what projects we buy and how much we pay. So this is very much needed transparency on the price of carbon credits, which is lacking at the moment. And this is how our evaluation process works in practice. Out of the thousands of projects which are certified under the international carbon standards, such as Vera and Gold Standard, we have evaluated more than 100 projects, out of which only 10 have passed into the portfolio. And our criteria cover not only climate integrity, but also biodiversity and community well-being. And the criteria were developed with the help of our panel in the beginning of 2020, when I actually joined Compensate. That was one of the first things I did. And our criteria go much beyond the existing standards on the market. And that is why we have discovered very concerning issues. So 90% of the 100 projects we have evaluated, so 9 out of 10 failed the criteria. And here I'm going to tell you why. So our criteria focus on forest-based projects, both conservation from like preventing deforestation, and then reforestation, afforestation projects. And they have different pros and cons, so I'm going to start with conservation projects. So the benefit here is that these projects protect high carbon dense existing sinks, which are also biodiversity hotspots. And projects are also addressing the socio-economic issues which are relating to deforestation, since local communities living there, they don't have any alternative and they turn to the forest just to earn income. And these projects are priced much lower on the market, so you get biodiversity benefits and social impacts, and the price is much lower, which makes them best quality price ratio. However, they have many disadvantages and risks. The first one and most important is overestimating the climate impact. And this can be easily achieved by setting an realistic baseline, and baseline means the basis on which you issue the carbon credits. So if you have a forest and you estimate that every year this forest will be deforested by, let's say, 3%, then you can issue a certain amount of credits per year and sell them to companies who are buying this. However, many of the projects we have screened and evaluated, they're overestimating this deforestation threat, and some projects, they don't, the threat doesn't even exist. It can be sanctuaries which have been protected for hundreds of years, and forests which are quite remote with no access to roads and low population density. However, the standards set quite low bar, and many of these projects, they're actually certified and sold to companies and individuals. Then the second issue is permanence, political risks, leakage, and illegal logging. So permanence refers to how long the trees will be standing, because if you make an offset claim and if the forest burns or it's logged for timber, then the claim is not valid anymore. And political risks is directly connected to the permanence, since if the government, most of these projects are in developing countries, and the governments can change their mind, and the forest which is now protected in 30 years could be logged completely. And leakage refers to, first is activity shift leakage. So if the local people were occasionally taking trees out of the forest, after the area is protected, they will just move around it. And they will still get the trees, just from different place. But for the climate, there is no difference, because trees will be cut and CO2 will be emitted. And market leakage refers to the demand for timber products. So in an area which has protected forests, newly protected, the demand for timber will be met by importing from somewhere else, even within the country or outside of the country. And the third key issue is possible community conflicts and human rights violations, which is extremely common in countries. For example, in Africa, there are many national parks which have become REDD+ projects, and in these parks, indigenous people and local communities could live illegally, like illegal squatters, and they have been doing this for generations. And now, with this high interest toward carbon projects, many of these parks are established projects, and the first thing which the government do is to remove all these people who are illegally living there. And this can lead to violent conflicts and human rights violations. And the last one is the socio-economic impacts, which in a way, the livelihood and the well-being of people is deteriorating, because they don't have the same access to the forest as they once had. And many people they need the access just to, for subsistence. So taking like berries or mushrooms, or hunting just for feeding your family. So this is all very common in these most vulnerable and poor areas. And if the project is forbidding this, it impacts directly the people. And here are the pros and cons of reforestation projects, which are slightly different. So planting trees is good because it reverses soil erosion, and it grows new carbon sinks. And usually the starting point is degraded land. So everything you build on top, like planting little trees which grow, everything is easy to calculate, and it's very difficult to overestimate, just like I mentioned with the conservation projects. And finally, we're only working with community-led projects which provide multiple benefits to the local communities. And in our cases, local communities are the landowners, and they plant trees in the lands which are unutilized. And in addition to the trees and fruits they get, they also receive employment in the project and direct cash payment for each carbon credit sold. And in one of our projects, the percentage is 70% of the carbon credit revenue is paid directly as a cash payment, which is quite unique on the market, where usually if there is some benefit sharing system, It is distributed to different activities, but people do not receive any direct cash. And some of the disadvantages are again related to permanence and leakage, which is to a lesser extent in comparison to the conservation projects. And there are huge issues when it comes to large-scale timber plantations. So they're problematic for many reasons. First one, they're not additional, financially speaking, because these plantations, they have rotation cycles, 10 to 20 years, and the timber is eventually cut in the end and sold as a timber. However, this is already a business model, so there is no need for additional carbon credit revenues, since the whole idea behind the carbon market is that it finances activities which wouldn't happen in the absence of the project. And this is not the case with timber plantations. And fast-growing monocultures of non-native species, which are fertilized abundantly, they're extremely bad for biodiversity, for the soil, so they really, they don't harbor any biodiversity. They're just rows of trees, and it's not a real forest. It's just a plantation which is cut. And areas in which there is interest towards large-scale plantations, there could be negative impacts for the local communities in terms of lower wages, import of non-local workers, which leaves local people out of the job market, then land grabbing. Companies can buy the land at very cheap prices that can lead to high food prices. And here I'm going to talk about good nature-based solutions and also how to reform the market. So here are 4 principles which I really like very much. They're from the University of Oxford's Nature-Based Solutions Initiative on what makes a good nature-based solution. And this overlap 100% with Compensate sustainability approach. So number 1 is that nature-based solutions are not substitute for rapid phase out of fossil fuels. This is something we have seen large companies are trying to do, and they get caught and accused of greenwashing. Number 2 is that nature-based solutions involve a wide range of ecosystems, including both land and sea. And at the moment, what we see is only interest towards trees, because it's easy, it's close to people, you can see the tree, it's tangible, but nature-based solution can go much further. The next one is to ensure community well-being and non-violation of human rights, is to involve indigenous peoples and also local communities to give their consent for the project and also that they really benefit from it. And last one is provide measurable benefits for biodiversity, which is currently lacking in most of the projects. And this is something which should be paid attention in the future, since biodiversity is declining significantly. And here are our recommendations for reforming the market, which are from our white paper, which was published in April this year, where I recommend everybody goes to our website and read it. It's extremely interesting. But here we have summarized the findings and the recommendations of the policymakers. Number 1 is solve the double claiming issue under Article 6, which we're discussing today, and then prevent low quality credits from entering the market by creating additional layer of criteria, just like what we have at Compensate. For buyers, we advise to first avoid, reduce, and then compensate the unavoidable emissions, and not to take the standards as a quality insurance, because this is not the case. And project developers, we advise to be conservative when estimating the climate impact and choose quality over quantity, because while there is an incentive to overestimate and sell more and get more revenue, on the other hand, if you produce low volumes but very high quality, you can get a premium price. So not necessarily they will lose something, they can gain from it. And last slide is about double claiming, corresponding adjustment, and contribution claim. And this is Compensate view. So if the voluntary market wants to be ambitious and go beyond what countries have already promised, there must be corresponding adjustment in place when making companies climate neutrality or net zero claims. So credits for which corresponding adjustment is not implemented, they still can be purchased and supported by companies, but the claim must be differentiated. This can be contribution claim, financing claim, or contributing to the NDCs. And projects protecting forests, biodiversity, they have their worth on their own right, so it doesn't have to be everything about carbon. So they can be supported by companies even if just because the whole planet biodiversity is decreasing and these projects are really needed. And if the carbon is not calculated correctly, you don't have to sell the carbon credits, you can just support these projects. And yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Efim. Thanks very much. So I just want to turn first to the audience, see if there are any questions on those presentations or more generally on this topic of how carbon markets can benefit developing countries. I don't see any, and I do have questions on my list. I'm also a bit blinded by these lights. I feel like I'm starting to see what rock stars feel like when they don't see the audience. There's someone in the back. Yes, sorry. We have some mics on the side, so you would need to just go up to those mics. Thank you. Please, if you can also go to. I think there are some mics there as well. We'll take 3 questions, so feel free to go.
Hello.
Yes, please.
Thank you for the intervention. So I'm working in Gilles, a French NGO, working as well on developing projects related to energy, and we use carbon credits and certification to fund our projects. And I think that for the last intervention, your manner of checking the real ethics of projects is really interesting, and we would like to do the same. And I wanted to know if you are working as well with the standards to help them improve their certification, their processes. Because you showed a recommendation for governments, for projects, and for companies, but not for standards. I wanted to know if you are working with them or not.
We'll just take one or 2 more questions and then answer them all together. So please go ahead.
Sorry, my voice is not very well, but it's not COVID, okay? But I have 2 questions. First one is, how do you think we can have a better control on the quality of the carbon market? And the second question is about the blue carbon. And how do you think, I know there is not a methodology approved by the IPCC for quantifying blue carbon, but how do you see, you panels, see the counting of blue carbon in this market? Thank you.
Hi. Would you have time for another question?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Hi, guys. This is Aruna from Carbon Brief. My question is, especially considering the status of negotiations, what are developing countries particularly worried about in terms of the landing zones for what emerges from the negotiations? Another question is, like, especially looking at non-greenhouse gas metrics, for instance, especially under 6.2 and the ITMOs. I mean, how exactly, for instance, this last iteration is still in brackets. It becomes sort of a free-for-all in which, you know, for instance, if a country achieves its forestry targets, then converting that into greenhouse gases or those metrics, how do you see that sort of working? And I think last one is like, especially the languages still should promote and consider human rights. It's still perhaps in the preamble stage. But I mean, are we pushing for stronger language, especially considering the many risks that so many of the speakers have spoken about? Yeah, that's it.
Thanks.
Can you take one more question?
I think we'll maybe address these and take another round afterwards if we have time. Should we start with Effie in the first question, whether you have engaged with standards and what your recommendations to standards would be?
Yeah, thank you for this question. So we have been very active on the advocacy front. We have participated in all these processes, consultations for the task force on scaling the voluntary carbon market. We have also had discussions with gold standard, with which we are very much aligned on things such as double claiming. And we have also had calls with Verra, and we have showed our findings and the issues we have discovered. So we have been having an active discussions. And we have proposed, we have outlined what is wrong with the current voluntary carbon market in our white paper, which I mentioned. And there we have also provided recommendations how the standards can improve. So yeah, we're doing a lot in that direction. And our goal, even though we are a small Finnish non-profit, we want to impact the whole market. And when I started this work 2 years ago, there was no information on the low quality credits. And nowadays, 2 years later, there are the biggest medias in the world. They're just publishing article after article on how not credible the whole system is and how much it needs to be reformed. So I'm extremely happy to see that there is awareness nowadays, which was missing before. Thank you.
Thanks. Maybe the second one, Robi could sorry? Yeah. Maybe the second question on how to better control the quality of credits. I'd be interested to hear from you. I mean, you talked about, yeah, how to better coordinate, I guess, the voluntary market, the voluntary actors with the governments and how they can work hand in hand. Is there a connection in that on how we can keep, I guess, both the supply and the demand side, all actors, including the buyers, accountable for how they're using these credits and for buying actually the right credits, given the situation we have now that we know there are good credits and there are bad credits. So yeah, coming back to the question I was asked, like how can we better control the quality of that?
I mean, I wouldn't have an answer on how to better control that, but you know, when you create such processes where different actors come together and discuss, that's the starting point, you know, like with government's views, because we talked to around 22 government representatives in doing the voluntary carbon market global dialogue. And you see that the concerns sometimes, they're all valid, but some are because of the lack of communication with other actors as well. So, you know, limited. So I think creating a platform for dialogue and bringing actors together is an important step to get there. In the work we didn't unpack this, issue, this aspects a lot. But you know, I can see the benefit of bringing actors together. Thank you.
Maybe we can turn to the last question about the status that's more closely connected to the status of negotiations. I'd like to hear from Christine on this, but maybe first turning to Mahesh. I mean, on this question of, yeah, what could developing countries be worried about in the development of markets, and you have experience, especially in terms of the local impacts and working with communities. How can we better involve local people to ensure that markets are not only not creating any harm, but actually contributing to sustainable development and really delivering benefits? So what are your lessons from the experience you've had on this?
Yeah. We, as India, as a developing countries, and the small countries and underdeveloped countries are worried about the carbon credits because we have a worst experience out of that. Because of my organization, I started because of the carbon credit. One industries, Gujarat Fluorochemical, in the first time they got the carbon credit 1,000 crore rupees. And they got the credit on the second week, there was a gas emission. And 3 villages are affected very heavily. But they got a carbon credit, so even the judiciary is telling them, oh, everything is fine, there is something else. So that's a human rights issue also. Right now, I mean, one industrialist, they are one hand investing on the solar and wind, on the other hand, buying a coal from the Australia and a lot of the coal power station and all. So one hand they are getting a credit of carbon, getting number of award because they are reducing the carbon in the name of the solar and wind. And on the other hand, they are also polluting. Who are the affecting basically? The poor people of the developing countries, they are affecting. Because they are, most of the industry, the surrounding the people of the industry, the poor people are residing. And they are the affected out of that. And under the carbon credit or any kind of project, or if you are asking a fund from the World Bank or IFC or Asian Development Bank or IMF, they are asking for the 2.5% community welfare fund. But there is no transparency. Because the fund is getting directly by the company in the name of the carbon credit or what so. And people don't know. And they do not spend 2.5% money for the community welfare. And that is why we are worried about. The one hand, they are getting the good credit and also good name in the world. But on the other hand, they are polluting a lot. And the developing countries, the government, they are allowed them because they want economic development. Like my country is talking very good about the UN, this platform. My Prime Minister talked on very good spoken in the first day of this conference. But on the other hand, we are getting a dilution of the environmental law and everything because we want industrial development, whatever it is. So that is why the carbon credit is a good kind of option for them to get a credit and pollute. It's a kind of license to pollute. So that is why we are worried about. And also you listen, a country like India, we have a sheep baking yard. So the sheep are coming to break in my country. They are full of the waste. And they are also same thing. That is why this kind of mechanism or something, and there is no proper monitoring and all. And even this Paris kind of agreement and all, we are not talking about this type of waste management or this thing, or the monitoring mechanism is not there. They are dependent on the host country approval, and host country is always favoring the industries because they want the development. And that is why developing countries, particularly poor people, government is not worried about. The people and the activist NGOs are worried about their peoples of this country, about their exploitation and all. That is why we are worried about. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks, Mahesh, for raising these issues around accountability and transparency. And I think in our work as Carbon Market Watch, as a watchdog, these are definitely some important concepts also to try to look beyond, like, okay, when you see a project beyond the glossy covers of often like smiling children in front of a school, to maybe exaggerate a bit, what is the actual impact, how much money are the communities really receiving, and what do these projects do beyond like the actual carbon impacts, let's say. But with that, turning to Kristin to share a bit her views on what are the red lines basically for developing countries, and maybe from your perspective in negotiations, how things are progressing, and what do you want to see out of Article 6?
Sure, thanks, Gilles. Before I answer that question, I did want to touch on the question of how to better control quality. I agree that that is a very broad question, but I think that one of the ways we can do that is by having informed and educated buyers. If from the demand side you have a demand for high quality credits that meet certain requirements, then that helps to control what's coming into the system, because it inevitably filters out those that you don't have demand for. So I just wanted to touch on that question. And I also wanted to touch on your blue carbon question as well. I think it's really important to get the methodology right on that before bringing it into the market prematurely. We have the example of Red Plus, which took many, many, many years to figure out the methodologies and what you need to address with regards to ensure that you have good, high-quality credits coming from those. And that provides a lot of lessons learned for blue carbon. But I do think that it takes some time to make sure that you have methodologies correct so that you avoid a situation where the credits that you're producing are not highest quality or you're not over-crediting, etc. So just to touch on those two. Moving to the negotiations. So developing countries are a broad grouping in the negotiations, as we all know, so I could only speak from the AOSIS perspective. And for us, we want to see a really high quality carbon market and strong, robust rules for cooperative approaches, which is under Article 6.2, and strong rules for Article 6.4, which is decentralized mechanism, and of course rules that allow Article 6.8 to get up and running as soon as possible. Of course, if you have been following the negotiations, you know that there have been multiple iterations of text coming out on Article 6, and each iteration changes a bit. But there are things in there that concern small island developing states, small countries from AOSIS, as it relates to ambition. There are some options in the text that do undermine ambition, and of course this is a consensus process, a party-driven process, so all parties' views have to be respected. But we do need to be very careful that as the UN, we're not blessing a system that will undermine ambition, while at the same time saying that climate change is a crisis and we need urgent action. So I won't go into the nitty-gritty details of all the things that concern us, but if you have been following the negotiations, you do know that accounting is really important. How we treat with the activities and units that come from the previous UN market mechanism, that is also a very sticky issue for many developing countries, seeing that we want to ensure that we are incentivizing new emissions reductions, because that's what we need to see to really close the mitigation gap. So I think I'll leave it there. If anyone wants to ask follow-up questions in that regard, I'm happy to answer, but I don't want to monopolize the mic. Thanks.
Thanks, Kristen. Are there any other questions from the audience?
I have one.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, I appreciated the comment about how not credible the whole system is, and also how these markets provide a license to pollute. But I was troubled by the idea that the ETS is so much better, because the European trading system has yet to exclude incineration from its technologies that it potentially supports. So I just see these systems failing around the world, not just in developing countries. And I think that this is because market economics cannot be the primary financing approach to solving the climate crisis. And I'm wondering if the panelists can reflect on that and what other financing approaches we might be needing to look toward. Thank you.
Thanks. Any other questions? Yeah, please.
Yes, hi, my name is Martin from PRI. I have two quick questions about carbon accounting, because we looked at the difference of the conserving forest versus reforestation. And I was wondering, two quick questions. One is like, it has been said, or it has been mentioned over and over again, that we have to keep the forests we have because they are carbon sinks. So that would be the first priority. Is that true? And secondly, if you talk about new carbon that is actually sucked out of the atmosphere, do old biodiverse forests suck more carbon out, or would the fresh, new reforested forests actually be more effective in taking carbon out of the atmosphere? Thinking on a purely technical level, how to get the most effective amount of carbon out of the atmosphere. What do you prioritize? Thanks.
Thank you. Should we just take these two questions?
If you can answer one more. So my name is Michaela, I'm with Indiana University. My question is mostly for Kristen. You made a comment about how developing countries, that encompasses a wide range of countries, and I'm specifically looking at how emerging economies like Brazil, India, and China are going to have an impact on Article 6. And so I was wondering if you could make a statement on how you think a beneficial outcome of Article 6 could help gear more financing towards least developed countries, as the Clean Development Mechanism from the Kyoto Protocol often ended up providing a lot of projects and financing in the larger emerging economies. So if you have any statement on that.
Thanks. I'm not sure who would like to address these questions first. Perhaps, yeah, would you like to start maybe addressing the questions on
Yeah, I can
forest?
start with a question on conservation versus reforestation. So this is a bigger issue. It's avoided emissions versus removals. And nowadays, we see on the market there is extremely strong demand for carbon removals. And that is prioritizing, in a way, afforestation, reforestation. However, this might not be the best way to do it, since natural tropical rainforest stores 150 tons of carbon per hectare, and in comparison, tree plantations in the rainforest store 7 tons of carbon per hectare per year. So you need 21 times less land to store the same amount of carbon, so it's more efficient to have fully grown forest. And big trees store more carbon than newly planted trees. They need like decades to grow and start accumulating considerable amount of CO2. So definitely there is no question. And again, repeating that many of the reforestation projects at the moment on the market are commercial timber plantations, which are destined to be cut already at the project start. This is the design of the project. So it is quite rare to find reforestation projects which are not plantations, and I have seen like a handful of these, and we have in our portfolio some good examples if you would like to see. But yeah, natural tropical forests are extremely important, not only because of the carbon, but as I said, biodiversity, hotspots, and also improving the well-being of local communities. Whereas in reforestation, you only have the carbon element, there is no biodiversity, and usually there are no local communities if it's a plantation. So,
Thanks.
Thanks.
Kristen, maybe you want to take the last question on how, what kind of outcome on Article 6 would we want to actually gear more finance to developing countries? And can we actually have a system that will reach that goal?
Sure. So I also want to touch on the question we got with regard to markets basically being a license to pollute. I will say that if markets are done right, they can help. But as Effie in her presentation, on her slide, I think you saw, I don't remember the exact words you used, but basically it should not replace decarbonization. It shouldn't replace domestic efforts to reduce emissions. But we recognize that there are some sectors that are hard to decarbonize. And in the interim, they may need to rely on markets somewhat. But you need to set up a market that really provides real emission reductions and goes beyond that as well to ensure that you're not giving that incentive or that license to pollute. So I think it's a delicate balance. I think on one hand, markets they have been given a very bad reputation because of things that have happened in the past. But I do think that there is a chance to rectify and do better for those hard to decarbonize sectors, while at the same time pursuing your domestic abatement efforts and moving towards decarbonization. So I'll stop there on that one. On the second question with regard to how we can get more finance for small islands and smaller developing countries, least developed countries, I think one of the things we need to really think about is how do we incentivize the private sector in our countries. Like I mentioned, there are barriers and gaps with regard to the size and scale and feasibility. So work needs to be done there. But the first step before we even do that is to get the rule sets agreed here so that we know what it is we're working towards. Once we are able to adopt the rule sets here in Glasgow and say, okay, this is the Article 6 framework that we're working with, then the private sector can say, okay, yes, we have certainty, we know what we need to do. And then from there, you can look at what needs to be done in small countries to drive that incentive and drive the finance to the small countries to be able to participate in the market. And I think that that is one of the opportunities that AOSIS countries sees with regards to carbon markets. There is an opportunity there for them to be a player in Article 6.4. I think one of the reasons that the larger developing countries were able to benefit from the previous UN mechanism is because they already had finance to get started. They didn't need the finance from the mechanism to get started, whereas with a lot of the smaller and developing states and these developed countries, we need the finance to get started. So I think you need to look at a couple aspects of incentivizing the private sector, capacity building of the private sector in small countries, and getting the finance there to get projects up and running for us to be able to benefit. So thanks for the question, and I think I'll stop there.
Thanks, Kristin. I would be interested to hear also from you, Robi, on especially the first question we heard. I think it is a really important point that we do have very, well, I can't find the word in English anymore, but the impacts of carbon markets until now, we can really doubt like the benefits that they have provided. There are a lot of credits out there that just don't represent the emission reductions they have. And so this does raise the question of, like, can we actually rely on market mechanisms to kind of address the climate crisis as we have it? And I know the Global Dialogue initiative you've been part of has really been trying to promote, not only improve carbon markets, but also promote their use within the private and the public sector. So what is your vision on that, and why do you think it's actually a solution when there are a lot of criticisms of these systems out there?
I mean, first let me go back, and I do apologize for that, on the quality of projects. And in interviewing country focal persons and others, and you know, in cases where country governments had you know, a stronger environmental social safeguard requirement, where projects had to go and ask, or in systems where projects, government was co-developer of a project, then there was a say in them, and there was a say in identifying good projects or scrutinizing them. And sometimes the environmental social safeguard entities also sitting within you know, the body that's responsible for following up the carbon market. So in such cases, and in cases where countries have advanced in being part of the VCM process, for instance, and being part of that, I would presume, because of the engagement, there is some sort of scrutiny on quality of projects. So that's one thing. And like I said, although projects, without their knowledge, projects get approved, in most cases, countries were aware of national governments were aware of this project in cases when, you know, they had such strong entities. And I think in terms of VCM having, you know, being a mechanism that can work in the future, I think we had a high level, I mean, it's through these focal points we had discussion, but you know, there's always an opportunity to implementing an NDC. If you look at the NDC, you need different avenues, you need different mechanisms, and the recommendation and the view, regardless from country governments, has been in our discussions that, you know, this can be an important avenue that they can utilize in implementing, at least getting additional financing for their NDC commitments.
Thank you. All right. Well, with that, unless we have any burning comments. Sorry?
I think I have one more closing remark.
One? Yeah, please go ahead.
Sorry to come back, but one last thing I wanted to say with regard to markets allowing us to move beyond what we've thought about markets in the past is something that AOSIS has been calling for in the negotiations, which is overall mitigation and global emissions. And that basically means that as part of participating in markets, you set aside some units that are just a benefit to the atmosphere. And I think that's one of the ways that will help us to get high quality markets, ensure that we have a high quality market, and allow us to move beyond that thinking that it's simply a license to pollute, because you're taking some units out of the system that can be used by anybody, that are correspondingly adjusted for, and they give that benefit to the atmosphere that helps push us a little bit further in our mitigation ambition. So I just wanted to come back on that one. Thanks.
Thanks, Kristen. Yeah, and I think that's really something that's very important to many climate NGOs advocating here at this COP as well. Thanks very much to everyone for joining us here, and to the audience. Thanks for sharing your questions as well.